strange historians. Strange historians.
You wake to the sound of grinding stone against stone, the rhythmic scraping echoing through limestone corridors that have swallowed human voices for over 3,000 years. Your hands press against cold sandstone as you rise, and suddenly you realize where you are, deep within a pharaoh's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, surrounded by hieroglyphs that seem to writhe in your flickering torchlight. The air tastes of myrrh and something else, something organic and ancient that makes your stomach turn. Your eyes adjust. You see them clearly, carved scenes covering every surface, depicting acts so intimate and bizarre that archaeologists spent decades debating whether to photograph them at all. These are not the sanitized images of Egyptian intimacy you learned about in school. A tease. Walls tell stories that would make modern audiences blush, stories of sacred prostitution, ritual defloration, and sexual practices so intertwined with religious belief that they shaped an empire for over 2 millennia. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world. It's connected across time and space by a shared curiosity about the past. Walk deeper into that tomb with me now, because what you're about to discover will forever change how you think about one of history's most fascinating civilizations. In 1323 BC, 14-year-old Ankhesenamun stood trembling in the antechamber of Karnak Temple. Her linen dress was so sheer, it barely qualified as clothing. Its gold jewelry adorning her neck, wrists, and ankles clinked softly as she shivered, not from cold, but from knowing what lay ahead. As the daughter of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten and the widow of boy king Tutankhamun, she was about to participate in one of ancient Egypt's most sacred and disturbing rituals, the Opet Festival's divine marriage ceremony. High priest, I emerged from the shadows, his shaved head gleaming with sacred oils, his eyes holding a hunger that had nothing to do with spiritual devotion. In just moments, Ankhesenamun would be expected to consummate a marriage with the god Amun-Ra himself, or rather, with I acting as the god's earthly vessel. This wasn't metaphorical. This wasn't symbolic. This was Egypt's most powerful religious leaders using divine mandate to claim the bodies of royal women. And it happened with terrifying regularity throughout pharaonic history. Papyrus records from Deir el-Medina, discovered by archaeologist Bernard Bruyère in Egypt, reveal that such sacred prostitution wasn't limited to royal women. Temple records show that hundreds of young girls served as God's wives, a euphemistic title for what amounted to ritualized sexual slavery. These girls, some as young as 12, were selected for their beauty and purity. It's then dedicated to various gods throughout Egypt's religious calendar. The selection process itself was brutal in its clinical efficiency. Temple priests would examine candidates naked, checking for physical imperfections that might offend the gods. A small scar, an uneven tooth, or even asymmetrical breasts could disqualify a girl from temple service, which, ironically, might have saved her from years of ritualized abuse disguised as religious duty. Dr. Joyce Tildesley's research at Manchester University uncovered temple accounts from Thebes dating to 1550 BC that detailed the daily lives of these sacred prostitutes. Because they lived in temple complexes, wore distinctive clothing that marked their status, and were forbidden from marrying or bearing children outside of their religious duties. When they did become pregnant from their temple service, the children were often dedicated back to the temples, creating generational cycles of religious sexual servitude. But the most disturbing aspect of these divine unions wasn't their frequency, was their public nature. During major religious festivals like Opet, Men, or Sed, thousands of Egyptians would gather to witness the pharaoh or high priest perform sacred marriages with temple women. These ceremonies weren't conducted in private chambers, but in full view of the populace, who believed they were witnessing actual divine intercourse that would ensure the Nile's flood, the harvest's abundance, and the kingdom's prosperity. Contemporary accounts from Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 450 BC, describe his shock at witnessing such ceremonies during his travels through Egypt. He wrote of seeing the most beautiful maidens of noble birth being prepared for unions with gods who appeared in human form, noting that the women showed visible signs of distress that the Egyptian observers seemed to interpret as religious ecstasy. Archaeological evidence from the Temple of Menet Coptos reveals carved scenes showing these divine unions in explicit detail. The god men, depicted with an erect phallus, is shown engaging with women whose faces are turned away, an artistic convention that some scholars interpret as indicating the women's reluctance or shame. Surrounding these central figures are carved musicians, dancers, and offerings, creating a festival atmosphere around what was essentially ritualized rape. The psychological toll on participants becomes clear when examining papyrus fragments from the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, which contains what may be the world's earliest recorded treatments for trauma. Several remedies describe treatments for women who had served the gods and subsequently suffered from what modern psychology would recognize as symptoms of sexual trauma: loss of appetite, inability to sleep, sudden weeping, and withdrawal from social contact. Yet, perhaps most chilling of all was how completely society accepted these practices. Marriage contracts from the New Kingdom period, 1552-1070 BC, routinely include clauses releasing husbands from their marital obligations if their wives were called to temple service. Fathers negotiated bride prices that explicitly factored in whether their daughters had already served in temples, with used women commanding lower payments despite their supposed divine blessing. Bubbling workshops reek of natron salt and decay. As the master embalmer examined the body of a young noblewoman who had died in childbirth in 945 BC, what was about to unfold in this mud brick building beside the Nile would have horrified the woman's family if they had known. But they didn't know, and they never would, because the mummification process held secrets that Egypt's embalmers guarded more fiercely than any pharaoh's treasure. Modern CT scans of female mummies from the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, conducted by Dr. Zahi Hawas's team in 2005, revealed evidence that has forced Egyptologists to confront one of ancient Egypt's most disturbing secrets: the systematic sexual abuse of female corpses during mummification. The scans showed clear signs of post-mortem sexual trauma in approximately 23% of female mummies examined, the damage occurring after death but before the final wrapping process. The Greek historian Herodotus first hinted at these practices in his histories. Written around 440 BC, he noted that families of beautiful women, or women of high rank, would wait several days before delivering bodies to embalmers to prevent indignities being offered to them. He cryptically added that one embalmer had been caught abusing a recently deceased woman and was subsequently killed by his fellow workers, not for the violation itself, but for being discovered. Papyrus fragments from Deir el-Bahri, discovered during excavations in 1881, contain what appears to be training instructions for embalmers that include disturbing directives about handling female corpses. The texts, written in hieratic script, discuss the need for purification rituals that involved opening all sacred passages of the deceased woman's body. Modern scholars initially interpreted these as standard evisceration procedures, but the specific anatomical language and ritual context suggests something far more sinister. The mummification process took 70 days, during which corpses remained in the embalmer's workshops with minimal oversight from families or religious authorities. Workshop records from Tanis dating to 1000 BC show that embalmers often worked alone during the night shifts, when most Egyptians believed the dead were most vulnerable to spiritual attack. These nocturnal working conditions created perfect opportunities for abuse that would never be detected or reported. Physical evidence of these violations comes not just from modern CT scans, but from ancient sources attempting to address the problem. The Harris Papyrus, now in the British Museum, contains legal documents from 1156 BC describing the prosecution of several embalmers for defiling the sacred vessels, a euphemistic legal term that scholars now believe referred to sexual abuse of corpses. The penalties were severe. Convicted embalmers faced execution, and their families were stripped of property and exiled from their communities. But the most disturbing aspect of these practices was their ritualistic nature. Evidence suggests that some embalmers believed sexual contact with the deceased transferred the woman's life force to the abuser, granting enhanced virility or longer life. Amulets found in embalming workshops often depicted sexual acts with mummified figures, and several papyri contain spells meant to be recited during such violations, treating necrophilia as a form of magical practice rather than simple abuse. The famous mummy of Queen Nefertiti's daughter, Mekhetana, died around 1330 BC at age 13, shows clear signs of post-mortem violation when examined with modern forensic techniques. Her mummy wrappings, originally thought to have been damaged by tomb robbers, actually show patterns of deliberate unwrapping and rewrapping in the pelvic area. Resin residue between the wrapping layers indicates the body was accessed multiple times during the mummification process, far beyond what any legitimate preservation technique would require. Contemporary accounts from Coptic Christian texts written centuries later describe the horror with which early Christians viewed Egyptian mummification practices. Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria, writing in 385 AD, specifically condemned the defilement of female corpses by those who claimed to serve the gods of death. His writings suggest that these practices continued well into the Roman period, becoming so notorious that Christian families refused Egyptian mummification services entirely. The psychological impact on embalmers themselves becomes evident when examining suicide rates among workers in mummification complexes. Records from Memphis showed that embalmers died by suicide at rates far exceeding other professions, often by drowning themselves in the Nyla method that Egyptians believed prevented the soul from reaching the afterlife. Some scholars suggest this represented guilt-driven self-punishment by men who had violated corpses but could not confess their crimes without facing execution. Perhaps most tragically, some evidence suggests that certain women were murdered specifically to provide fresh corpses for necrophilic practices. The mummy of a young woman discovered in the Saqqara necropolis shows signs of intentional poisoning with oleander, a plant that kills quickly but leaves the body intact and suitable for mummification. Her wrappings contain papyrus fragments with prayers asking forgiveness from Osiris, suggesting her embalmer knew she had been murdered specifically for their use. Princess Sediment pressed her forehead against the cool limestone wall of her chamber in Malkata Palace as she listened to her father's footsteps approaching in 1358 BC at 23 years old. She had already borne her father, Pharaoh Amenhotep III, at least one childhood daughter who now played in the palace gardens, unaware that her grandfather was also her father. Tonight, like so many nights before, Sediment would fulfill her duty as both daughter and wife, perpetuating a cycle of incest that had defined Egyptian royalty for over a millennium. Royal incest in ancient Egypt wasn't an aberration or historical exaggeration. It was systematic, deliberate, and documented with clinical precision in official royal records. The Cairo Museum's collection of royal mummy DNA, analyzed by geneticist Dr. Karsten Pusch in 2010, revealed that pharaonic family trees resembled biological disasters more than royal lineages. Tutankhamun himself was the product of a brother-sister union, and genetic analysis shows he suffered from multiple congenital disorders, including spina bifida, clubfoot, and temporal lobe epilepsy, all likely results of generational inbreeding. The practice began with Egypt's earliest dynasties around 3100 BC, but reached its most extreme expression during the 18th dynasty, 1552-1295 BC. Pharaoh Thutmose I married his sister, Amos. Their son, Thutmose II, married his half-sister, Hatshepsut, and the pattern continued with obsessive regularity. Royal marriage contracts from this period, preserved on papyrus in the Metropolitan Museum, use specific legal language, distinguishing between wives who were sisters of the body, full sisters, and sisters of the house, half-sisters, with different inheritance rights assigned to children from each category. But the extent of royal incest went far beyond sibling marriage. Pharaoh Amenhotep II married 3 of his daughters, and palace records from Amarna show that Akhenaten maintained sexual relationships with at least 6 of his daughters simultaneously. One limestone relief from his capital at Amarna depicts the pharaoh kissing one daughter while another sits on his lap, with hieroglyphic text identifying both girls as his beloved wives and daughters of his body. The psychological toll on royal women becomes apparent, examining their abbreviated lifespans and frequent mysterious deaths. Queen Enkisenomon, daughter and wife of Akhenaten and later wife of Tutankhamun, survived to age 27 ancient by royal standards. Her mummy, discovered in 2010, shows evidence of chronic depression through bone analysis, vitamin D deficiency from rarely leaving palace chambers, stress fractures from physical abuse, and signs of frequent pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or infant death. Medical papyri from the Edwin Smith collection describe treatments for conditions that modern doctors recognize as consequences of incest. Remedies for children born twisted include instructions for splints, exercises, and herbal treatments that suggest royal physicians were dealing with regular cases of birth defects. One particularly disturbing text describes a surgical procedure for infants born with sealed passages, likely referring to the genital malformations common in severely inbred populations. The most chilling evidence comes from the royal mummy cache discovered in 1881 at Asir el-Bahari. Of the 11 royal mummies found there, DNA analysis revealed that 9 were the products of incestuous unions, and 7 showed evidence of significant genetic disorders. 2 infant mummies found in Tutankhamun's tomb were his daughters, born of his marriage to his half-sister, Enkisenomon, and both suffered from neural tube defects that made survival impossible. Palace intrigue often centered around which daughters would be selected for royal marriage. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and neighboring kingdoms, contained several messages from foreign rulers expressing horror at Egyptian marriage customs. King of Mitanni wrote to Amenhotep III in 1350 BC, "Your daughters who are wives are numerous, but you have not sent me any of your daughters in marriage. Why is this? Your daughters are your wives. Your wives are your daughters." This confuses my scribes when they write marriage agreements. Contemporary records revealed that Egyptian royal women often attempted to escape their fate through various means. Several papyri describe daughters fleeing to neighboring kingdoms only to be forcibly returned by Egyptian armies. One text from 1345 BC describes Princess Bekhetaten's attempt to seek asylum with the Hittites, writing to their king, "My father wishes to make me his wife, as he did my sisters, but I would rather die in foreign lands than submit to such violation of nature's law." The practice created its own perverted court culture, where normal family relationships became impossible. Royal children grew up unsure whether their mothers were actually sisters or aunts, whether their brothers were actually fathers or uncles. Palace records from the time of Ramesses II describe a complex system of titles and etiquette designed to navigate these confused relationships, with specific protocols for addressing relatives who occupied multiple family roles simultaneously. Religious justification for incest came through identification with the gods Isis and Osiris, who were siblings married to each other. Temple reliefs show royal couples making offerings, while hieroglyphic text emphasizes their sibling relationship as a divine blessing. However, private papyri from noble families reveal widespread revulsion at royal practices. One nobleman wrote to his son around 1330 BC, "The royal house breeds like animals in their dens. Sister with brother, father with daughter. This is why the gods curse their children with twisted limbs and early death." The genetic consequences compounded with each generation. By the end of the 18th dynasty, royal infants were dying at birth rates exceeding 60%, and surviving children often suffered from intellectual disabilities, physical deformities, and shortened lifespans. Tutankhamun's own mummy reveals a young man who could barely walk without assistance, suffered from chronic pain, and died at age 19 from complications that genetic analysis suggests were directly related to his inbred heritage. Oil lamps flickered in the temple of Hathor at Dendora as 12-year-old Nefertari lay on the stone altar, her small hands gripping the carved edges until her knuckles turned white. In 1290 BC, she was about to become the latest victim of one of ancient Egypt's most brutal religious practices, ritualized defloration performed by priests to open the sacred gateway for the gods. The ceremony would be witnessed by dozens of temple officials, recorded by scribes, celebrated by a community that saw her violation as a divine blessing. Archaeological evidence from the Temple of Mut at Karnak reveals that such ceremonies were far from rare occurrences. Stone tablets cataloging temple activities from 1400 to 1200 BC list over 300 individual defloration rituals, complete with the names of girls involved, their ages, and the specific priests who performed the ceremonies. The youngest girl recorded was 9 years old. The oldest was 16. Most were between 12 and 4, barely past puberty in a society where childhood ended early and brutally. The process began with elaborate purification rituals that lasted 3 days. Cows selected for defloration were bathed in sacred pools, anointed with oils mixed with frankincense and myrrh, hand-fed special foods believed to enhance their spiritual receptivity. During this preparation period, they were forbidden from speaking to anyone except designated temple priestesses, who instructed them on their divine duties and warned them that resistance or displays of fear would anger the gods. Papyrus fragments from the Ramesseum describe the theological justification for these practices. Egyptian priests believed that female virginity contained special spiritual power that could only be properly harvested through ritual defloration, performed by men who had undergone specific purification rites. The act itself was considered a form of sacrifice, with the girl's blood and pain offered to deities in exchange for divine favor on the entire community. The ceremonies followed rigid protocols documented in temple teaching texts discovered at Edfu. The girl would be brought before the assembled witnesses, dressed in a sheer linen gown and gold jewelry, marking her status as a sacred offering. Incense would be burned while temple musicians played specific hymns meant to invoke the presence of fertility gods. High priests representing the deity would then deflower the girl using implements that were preserved as sacred relics of fine knives, stone phalluses, or specially carved wooden objects that were believed to channel divine power. Dr. Joanne Fletcher's analysis of human remains found in temple complexes at Abydos revealed physical evidence of these practices. Skeletal remains of young females show signs of pelvic trauma consistent with violent sexual assault, often accompanied by evidence of infection and sometimes death from internal injuries. Carbon dating places these remains throughout Egypt's imperial period, suggesting the practices continued for over 500 years. The psychological aftermath of these ceremonies was systematically ignored or reinterpreted through religious doctrine. Girls who showed signs of trauma muteness, withdrawal, or self-harm were said to be touched by the divine and often dedicated permanently to temple service. Medical papyri contain treatments for divine madness in young women, including herbal remedies for violent outbursts, sleeplessness, refusal to eat symptoms. Modern psychology recognizes as indicators of severe sexual trauma. Some temples developed elaborate hierarchies around defloration ceremonies, with different priests specializing in different aspects of the ritual. The Chester Beatty Papyrus VI contains administrative records showing that certain priests held the specific title opener of the sacred gateway, a position that came with special privileges, including increased food rations, better housing, and selection rights over which girls they would deflower. These positions were highly sought after and often passed from father to son, creating dynasties of ritualized abusers. Regional variations in these practices were documented by traveling scribes who recorded cultural differences between temple complexes. Canned in Lower Egypt, defloration ceremonies were typically performed during the inundation season when the Nile flooded, symbolically linking the girls' bleeding to the river's life-giving waters. In Upper Egypt, the ceremonies aligned with harvest festivals, with the girls' violation seen as ensuring fertility of both crops and livestock. The most disturbing records come from the Temple of Men at Coptos, where annual festivals included mass defloration ceremonies involving dozens of girls simultaneously. Greek visitor Strabo, writing in 25 BC, described witnessing such a festival and noted shock at seeing maidens no older than children being violated by priests while crowds cheered and threw flowers. His account mentions that several girls died during the ceremonies from blood loss or shock, but their deaths were celebrated as signs of divine acceptance. Economic records reveal that families were often compensated for providing daughters for these ceremonies, but the payments were structured to prevent refusal. Temple ledges from Thebes show that families received grain, livestock, or land grants, but only after their daughters had completed their sacred service. Families who attempted to withdraw their daughters before ceremonies faced severe penalties, including loss of property, exile, or forced labor obligations. Some surviving texts hint at resistance networks among women who attempted to protect young girls from selection for these ceremonies. Papyrus fragments from private archives describe coded language used to warn families when temple scouts were seeking new candidates. One text from 1250 BC reads, "When the lotus seekers come to your door, remember that the river runs deep, but also runs away." Scholars believe this was a reference to escape routes used by families fleeing to avoid having their daughters selected for defloration ceremonies. Twilight settled over the temple of Bastet at Bubastis as hundreds of oil lamps were lit throughout the complex, their flickering light casting dancing shadows across walls covered in hieroglyphs depicting cats, dancers, and scenes of ritual ecstasy. In 570 BC, Ptolemaic Egypt was preparing for one of its most notorious religious festivals, a 3-day celebration where ordinary women transformed into sacred prostitutes, offering their bodies to strangers in honor of the cat goddess. What unfolded during these festivals would shock even seasoned ancient historians. Yet, it represented just one aspect of a religious prostitution system that had operated throughout Egypt for over 2 millennia. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 450 BC, described his personal witness of such festivals once a year. The women of this region gather at the temple of Bastet, and for 3 days they offer themselves to any man who brings proper payment to the goddess. No woman may refuse any man during this time, whether he be Egyptian, Greek, Nubian, or Persian. The money paid goes to the temple, but the act itself is considered the most sacred duty a woman can perform. Archaeological excavations at Bubastis, conducted by Edouard Novell between 1887 and 1889, uncovered physical evidence of these prostitution festivals beneath the temple floors. Archaeologists found thousands of small pottery tokens bearing the image of Bastet on one side and explicit sexual imagery on the other. These tokens, carbon dated to various periods between 800 and 200 BC, served as payment receipts for sexual services during religious festivals. The sheer number of tokens, over 12,000, recovered from a single excavation, sites suggest that these festivals involved thousands of women, providing sexual services to thousands of men over relatively short periods. But sacred prostitution in Egypt extended far beyond annual festivals. Temple records from Philae, discovered during the Aswan High Dam rescue operations in the 1960s, document a permanent class of sacred prostitutes called God's Wives of Amun, who served male temple visitors year-round. These women lived in special quarters within temple complexes, wore distinctive clothing that advertised their availability, and followed strict religious protocols governing their sexual services. The daily lives of these sacred prostitutes are documented in remarkable detail through papyrus archives discovered at Tebtunis in 1899. Personal letters between prostitutes revealed the psychological toll of their situation. One woman wrote to her sister around 200 BC, "I have served 37 men this month, and still the goddess demands more. My body aches, but worse is my heart, which grows harder each day like stone left in the sun. I prayed to Bastet to release me from this service, but she remained silent." Economic records show that sacred prostitution generated enormous revenue for Egyptian temples. Count books from the Temple of Sobek at Crocodilopolis detail payments from sexual services alongside offerings of grain, livestock, and precious metals. During peak festival periods, prostitution revenues exceeded all other temple income combined. This economic dependence created powerful incentives to recruit new prostitutes and expand sexual services, regardless of the human cost. The recruitment of sacred prostitutes followed patterns that modern observers would recognize as human trafficking. Poor families were approached by temple representatives who offered to take daughters as servants of the goddess, promising good food, shelter, and spiritual rewards. Once girls entered temple complexes, they rarely left. Legal documents from Oxyrhynchus describe several cases where families attempted to retrieve daughters who had been recruited for temple service, only to be told that the girls had made sacred vows that could not be broken without divine punishment. Medical papyri from the Kahun archive contained extensive information about treating diseases and injuries common among sacred prostitutes, remedies for temple sickness, likely sexually transmitted infections impaired repeatedly, along with treatments for pregnancy prevention, abortion-inducing herbs, and healing salves for genital injuries. One particularly disturbing text describes surgical procedures for repairing severe internal damage caused by violent clients, suggesting that abuse was common and systematic. The age of girls entering sacred prostitution dropped significantly during periods of economic hardship, such as famines or military conflicts. Temple records show increases in divine dedications of girls as young as 10 or 11 years old. T. Wilbur Papyrus, dating to 1141 BC, contains a census of sacred prostitutes at various temples that lists dozens of girls under age 14, several described as having not yet reached womanhood but already serving male clients. Regional variations in sacred prostitution practices were documented by Greek and Roman visitors who traveled throughout Egypt. In Memphis, prostitutes served clients in underground chambers beneath the main temple complex with elaborate ventilation systems and soundproofing that suggests the activities were deliberately hidden from public view. At Elephantine, prostitution took place in gardens surrounding the temple, with clients and prostitutes engaging in sex acts while other visitors prayed and made offerings nearby. The psychological control exercised over sacred prostitutes was reinforced through religious indoctrination that began in childhood. Girls were taught that sexual service to strangers was the highest form of worship, that their bodies were vessels for divine energy, and that resistance or unhappiness indicated spiritual failure. Confession texts found at various temple sites show prostitutes writing prayers asking forgiveness for feelings of revulsion, jeer, or desire to escape their duties. Some prostitutes attempted to document their experiences in ways that survived the centuries. Graffiti carved into temple walls at Edfu includes messages from women serving as sacred prostitutes, many expressing desperation or resignation. One inscription, dated to 1156 BC, reads, "Isis knows the pain in my heart, but I cannot speak it aloud. May other daughters be spared this blessing." Another states simply, "I have forgotten my name, but the goddess remembers my body." The practice of sacred prostitution created complex legal and social problems that Egyptian courts struggled to address. Court records from Thebes describe cases where men contracted sexually transmitted diseases from sacred prostitutes and demanded compensation from temples. Other legal documents detailed disputes over children born from sacred prostitution encounters, with questions about paternity, inheritance rights, and whether such children belonged to their mothers or to the temples where they were conceived. In 1279 BC, the embalmer's workshop beside the Valley of the Kings hummed with activity as User had prepared the mummy of a noble woman named Merit Pet for her eternal journey. But this preparation involved far more than the removal of organs and preservation of flesh. According to religious texts carved deep within royal tombs, Merit Pet would need her sexual organs intact and functional for the afterlife, where she would be expected to provide sexual services to male spirits, gods, and potentially the pharaoh himself throughout eternity. The mummification process, therefore, included specific procedures to ensure that female corpses remained sexually viable for their posthumous duties. The pyramid texts, dating from 2400 BC and representing some of Egypt's oldest religious writings, contain explicit descriptions of sexual activities expected in the afterlife. Dead pharaohs are promised beautiful women who serve them in all ways, while female spirits are described as existing primarily to provide sexual pleasure to male souls. The text known as Pyramid Text 690 states, "The king will possess the wives of the gods, and they will satisfy his desires as they satisfied the desires of their divine husbands when they lived." Archaeological evidence from tombs in the Valley of the Queens reveals that noble and royal women were buried with objects specifically designed for sexual use in the afterlife. Dr. Joanne Fletcher's excavations at Kivi 55, believed to be the tomb of one of Ramesses II's daughters, uncovered a collection of phallic objects made from wood, ivory, and stone. These objects were wrapped in linen and placed between the mummy's legs, positioned to remain accessible to the deceased woman's spirit. Similar objects have been found in dozens of female tombs from the New Kingdom period. The mummification process for women included procedures not performed on male corpses, designed to preserve sexual functionality for the afterlife. Papyrus documents from the workshops at Thebes describe the insertion of resin-soaked linen into female corpses, vaginal canals, ostensibly to prevent collapse of tissues during preservation. However, the positioning and materials used suggest these insertions were meant to maintain the shape and accessibility of sexual organs rather than simply preserve them. Tomb paintings from the burial chambers of high-ranking officials depict scenes of the deceased engaging in sexual acts with female servants who died with them. In the tomb of Vizier Rickmeyer TT 100, dated to 1450 BC, wall paintings showed the deceased official copulating with women identified as his eternal servants, while other figures prepare food and entertainment. These images weren't decorative or symbolics, they were instruction manuals for activities expected to continue in the afterlife. The practice of sacrificing female servants to accompany male tomb owners into death was documented extensively during Egypt's early dynastic period, but continued in modified forms throughout pharaonic history. Skeletal remains from subsidiary tombs beside major burial sites show evidence of ritual strangulation, poisoning, or live burial of young women. The tomb of Pharaoh Jer at Abydos, dating to 3000 BC, contained the remains of 338 sacrificed servants, with forensic analysis showing that 127 were young women who showed no signs of natural death. Religious texts found in private tombs describe the eternal sexual duties expected of women in the afterlife. The Book of the Dead, specifically chapter 125, excludes a section known as the negative confession, where souls must deny various sins before the gods. For women, this confession includes promises to serve the desires of righteous men and to open myself to those who have earned divine favor. These texts make clear that female souls were expected to provide sexual services, not as a reward for their own virtue, but as punishment for their inherently sinful nature. Forensic examination of female mummies has revealed evidence of post-mortem sexual positioning designed to facilitate necrophilic activities. The mummy of Queen Hinata, wife of High Priest Panajamai, shows signs that her legs were repositioned and held open during the wrapping process. Similar positioning appears in dozens of female mummies from the 21st dynasty, suggesting systematic preparation of female corpses for sexual access. The tomb of Pharaoh Seti I contains one of the most disturbing examples of afterlife sexual expectations. Hidden chambers behind the main burial hall, discovered only in 1960, contain explicit wall paintings showing the deceased pharaoh engaged in sexual acts with female deities, goddesses, and mortal women. The hieroglyphic texts accompanying these images describe the women as eternal concubines who will satisfy the king's desires throughout eternity without rest or complaint. Burial goods, specifically designed for afterlife sexual activities, appear regularly in both royal and noble tombs. The tomb of Yuya and Thuya, parents of Queen Tai, contained a collection of objects that archaeologists initially cataloged as religious implements, but which modern examination revealed to be sophisticated sex toys. These objects, carved from ebony and ivory with remarkable anatomical accuracy, were wrapped in the finest linen and placed in cedar boxes inscribed with prayers for their effectiveness in the afterlife. Medical papyri contain spells and procedures for ensuring that mummified women remain sexually attractive to male spirits. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus includes instructions for preventing facial disfiguration during mummifications, specifically for female corpses, noting that ugliness repels the desires of gods and men even in death. These procedures were more expensive and time-consuming than standard mummification, creating a lucrative specialization for embalmers who catered to wealthy families wanting to ensure their daughters remained desirable in the afterlife. Contemporary accounts from Greek and Roman visitors describe their horror at Egyptian burial practices involving women. Diodorus Siculus, writing in 50 BC, noted his shock at learning that Egyptian women are prepared for death as if they were preparing for marriage, with great attention paid to their sexual organs and their ability to please men even beyond the grave. He described witnessing funeral preparations where deceased women were positioned and dressed as if they were courtesans awaiting clients. The psychological impact on living Egyptian women of knowing their eternal fate is documented in surviving personal letters and diary fragments. One woman wrote to her sister around 1200 BC, "I fear death, not for the pain of dying, but for the eternal servitude that awaits. In life, I may choose my husband, but in death, I must serve any spirit who desires me." Another letter, found in a tomb at Saqqara, contains a woman's plea to the gods to allow her to die before her beauty faded, hoping that ugliness might spare her from sexual demands in the afterlife. Sacred lakes beside temples reflected torchlight during the most abhorrent festivals, where thousands gathered to witness acts that would have been criminal in daylight, but became sacred under the cover of religious ceremony. Aristocratic women, Temple prostitutes and captured foreign slaves mingled in scenes of ritualized sexual violence that participants believed would ensure divine favor. Children born from these encounters were raised as temple property, continuing cycles of abuse that lasted centuries. Yet perhaps most disturbing was how completely Egyptian society normalized these practices. Marriage contracts routinely included clauses releasing husbands from obligations if wives were called to serve gods sexually. Fathers calculated bride prices based on daughters' previous temple service. Medical texts treated trauma from ritual, rape as divine madness requiring gratitude rather than healing. When Rome finally conquered Egypt in 30 BC, one of the first acts of Octavian was to ban temple prostitution and ritual defloration ceremonies. Christian missionaries arriving centuries later found temples abandoned, their walls still bearing explicit carvings that local Egyptians had grown too ashamed to explain to their children. Walk back through those tomb corridors now, past hieroglyphs, whose meanings we're only beginning to understand. Each symbol tells a story of a civilization that saw beauty in brutality, found divinity in degradation, and convinced itself that the suffering of the innocent was the price of the gods' favor. Ancient Egypt's intimate practices reveal humanity's capacity to sanctify the unspeakably reminder that throughout history, the most monstrous acts have often worn the mask of the sacred. Step back into daylight, but remember what lurks in those shadows. Remember the voices that echo still through limestone corridors, calling out warnings across millennia. Remember that behind every glorious civilization lies secrets written in blood and tears, preserved forever in stone.